In the autumn of 1873, the village of Ashwick-be-the-Wold lay cloaked in the kind of quiet that only the English countryside can sustain. A hush, woven from damp, moss-rusted iron gates and the slow sigh of ash trees shedding their leaves onto gravel paths, gone soft with neglect. The manor at its heart, Blackheath Hall, stood apart from its neighbors, not by grandeur, for it was neither the largest nor the most ornate of the county S.A. gentry houses, but by a peculiar stillness that seemed to radiate from its soot-streaked brick and shuttered windows. Built in the reign of George III and expanded under Victoria's early years, it bore the quiet dignity of a place that had once known warmth but had long since surrendered to the slow erosion of time and private sorrow. Its master, Alistair Whitmore, a widower of moderate fortune and lesser renown, was known locally as a man of punctilious habits and restrained emotion, the sort who tipped his hat at church but never lingered for tea, who paid his accounts on the first of the month and returned borrowed books with not a page bent. To outward appearances, he was the very model of Victorian respectability: starched collars, measured speech, and a study lined with bound ledgers that smelled faintly of camphor and beeswax. Yet even in those early days, before the whispers began to coil through parlors and post offices like wood smoke through floorboards, there were those who noticed small disturbances in the household's rhythm. The cook, Mrs. Elkins, who served the Whitmore family for 17 years, until her sudden departure in '71, later confided to her sister in Bristol that the girls never came down for supper after dusk. No matter how clear the skies or how festive the occasion, she spoke of muffled voices behind the west wing door, of footfalls that ceased the moment a servant approached, and of a piano in the music room that played no tunes, but sometimes gave off a single sustained note when no one was near. Like a breath held too long, she said, the daughters, Eleanor and Clara, were rarely seen beyond the grounds. When they did apron rare walks to the village green or at Sunday service, they moved with a synchronicity that bordered on the uncanny. Their steps matched, their gazes lowered, their hands tucked into matching gloves of dove-gray kid leather. Neighbors assumed it was the strictness of a grieving father. Few considered that grief, however profound, seldom demands such perfect silence. The first rupture in this fragile facade came not with a scream or a scandal, but with absence. In the spring of 1874, both girls vanished from public view entirely. No explanation was offered. Letters to former school friends went unanswered. The piano in the music room fell permanently mute. Alistair Whitmore continued to attend vestry meetings, to inspect tenant farms, to take his evening constitutional along the yew hedge. Yet his eyes, once described by the rector as steady as a compass, now held a distant, glassy quality, as though he were watching something unfold just beyond the reach of ordinary sight. It was during this period that the first curious detail entered the record. The manor's accounts, usually balanced to the penny, began to show irregular withdrawals, modest sums paid in cash, always on the third Thursday of the month, always marked only with the initials VR. No vendor by those initials could be found in the district books. The local bank clerk, a man of 40 years' discretion, later recalled that Whitmore never met his gaze when collecting the notes, and that his hand trembled slightly, though the weather was mild and his coat was. Rumors, as they do in villages where news travels by kettle and kneading trough, began to sprout like fungi after rain. One version held that the girls had been sent abroad for their health. Another, that they had taken vows in a secluded convent in Yorkshire. But the most persistent tale whispered over laundry lines and behind the thick glass of pub windows was that Alistair Whitmore had made a bargain, not with creditors, nor with the crown, but with something older, something that did not trade in coin but in presence. The source of this notion was never traced, yet it spread with the tenacity of ivy that the daughters had not left Blackheath Hall at all, but remained within its walls, unseen, unheard, yet somehow still accounted for. The gardener, a taciturn man named Hargrove, claimed he once saw candlelight flickering in the east turret long after the household had rented a room that had been unused since the death of Mrs. Whitmore, whose portrait still hung in the hall, her eyes seeming to follow visitors with a sorrow too deep for paint to contain. It was this atmosphere of suspended unease, neither accusation nor proof, but a persistent uneasiness in the air, like the smell of ozone before a storm, that drew the attention of outsiders. A county inspector visiting on a matter of land, Titland noted in his private journal that the house felt watched, not by eyes, but by echoes. A traveling tutor engaged briefly to review Alistair's late wife's botanical sketches wrote to a colleague that he had heard on 3 separate nights the faint sound of 2 voices singing a lullaby in harmony, clear as silver bells, yet so distant they might have been singing from beneath the floorboards. Most curiously, the manor's servants, though few in number, never spoke ill of their employer. Indeed, they defended him with a loyalty that bordered on reverence. When pressed, the housemaid would only say, "He pays well and asks for nothing, except quiet." That phrase, "asks for nothing except quiet," would recur again and again in later testimonies, spoken with a mixture of gratitude and dread, as though silence were both a gift and a debt. By the winter of 1875, Blackheath Hall had become a place people avoided after twilight, not out of fear of ghosts. Victorians were too rational for that, but out of a deeper, more unsettling intuition that something within those walls had ceased to obey the ordinary laws of human conduct, and that to witness it might be to become entangled in its logic. Yet Alistair Whitmore remained unchanged in his routines, his ledgers, his Sunday pew. He never remarried. He never sold the estate. And when questioned delicately by the parish clerk about the girls' whereabouts, he replied only, "They are well provided for," a phrase so bland it might have been copied from a will. But those who knew him best, those who had seen the slight tremor in his hand as he signed a check-marked V, understood that provision had been made not in the manner of fathers, but in the manner of men who have bargained with what cannot be named. The first tangible trace of what might have transpired within Blackheath Hall emerged not from the lips of servants or the gossip of villagers, but from a bundle of correspondence discovered decades later in the attic of a solicitor's office in Bath. These letters, foxed at the edges, untied with faded violet ribbonhead, belonged to Miss Beatrice Mallory, a distant cousin of Alistair Whitmore's late wife, who had visited the manor briefly in the summer of 1873, not long before the daughter's disappearance from public life. Her observations, recorded in a hand that grew increasingly hurried and slanted, were at first those of a conventional guest, descriptions of meals, weather, and the quiet charm of country repose. Yet as the weeks passed, her tone shifted subtly at first. Then with mounting she wrote of Eleanor and Clara not as girls, but as shadows in silk, noting how they would sit for hours in the conservatory without speaking, their heads bowed over needlework that never seemed to progress beyond the same floral motif. More disturbing was her account of an evening when, returning from a stroll, she heard the girls rehearsing a duet in the music room, only to find the room empty upon entering, the piano lids shut, and the air thick with the scent of bergamot and something else, like whetstone after rain. Miss Mallory's final letter, dated October 12, 1873, contained a passage so chilling in its restraint that it was later copied verbatim into the confidential notes of a Home Office inquiry. "I asked Clara why she never writes to her old schoolmates. She did not look up, but her sister answered for her, 'We are not permitted to speak of where we are going.' I assumed it referred to some continental finishing school, but when I pressed, both fell silent, and their hands always held apart. In company gripped each other so tightly, their knuckles turned white. That night, I dreamt I heard coins counting in the walls." The letter ended abruptly, with no customary salutation, and Miss Mallory never returned to Blackheath Hall. Her family later claimed she suffered a nervous affliction following the visit and was confined to a seaside sanatorium until her death in 1878. The letters themselves were nearly discarded as irrelevant estate clutter, saved only because the solicitor's clerk, himself a student of abnormal psychology, sensed in their phrasing a pattern too precise to be mere hysteria. Other artifacts surfaced in time, each adding a thread to a tapestry whose design remained stubbornly obscured. A ledger, recovered from the manor's study after Alistair Whitmore's death in 1881, contained not only the recurring withdrawals, but also marginalia, in a cramped, unfamiliar hand notations such as third bell, new moon, and binding renewed. These phrases, meaningless to the probate court, were later cross-referenced with almanacs and found to correspond with lunar phases and the ringing schedules of the village church bell. Stranger still was the discovery, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Pilgrim's Progress, of a small brass disc etched with concentric circles, and the words, "He who gives holds. He who keeps loses." The object bore no maker's mark, yet metallurgical analysis conducted in 1912 at the request of an antiquarian society revealed it to be composed of an alloy uncommon in England, but known in certain continental esoteric traditions: tin, silver, and a trace of mercury. The last element associated in folk belief with thresholds and messages between worlds. Testimonies from those who had glimpsed the interior of the manor in its final years grew more fractured but no less consistent in their emotional tenor. The postman who delivered Whitmore's weekly newspaper until the end recalled that the front door was always answered by the master himself, never a servant, and that he would accept the paper without a word, his eyes fixed just beyond the visitor's shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear from the lane. A tradesman sent to repair the conservatory glass in '79 swore he saw, through an upper window, two figures standing perfectly still in a room draped in black cloth. Not mourning drapes, he insisted, but like the kind used in photographic studios. Yet when he mentioned it to Whitmore, the gentleman only smiled thinly and said, "You must have mistaken the mannequins. My wife collected them." No such mannequins were listed in the estate inventory. Perhaps the most unsettling evidence came not from human sources, but from the house itself. In 1883, during an inspection prior to the property essay eventual sale, a workman clearing debris from the disused east wing uncovered a section of floorboard that had been nailed down with unusual force. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity containing dried rose petals, a child's hair ribbon, ivory silk, embroidered with the initial C, and a single sheet of music paper. The notation was incomplete, a melody in C minor, 5 bars long, followed by empty staves stretching to the page's edge. Musicologists later examined the fragment and noted its structure. The harmony modulated in a way that defied conventional theory of the period, employing intervals that created a sense of unresolved tension, as though the tune were perpetually awaiting a final note that never came. When played on a period-appropriate piano, the fragment produced an effect described by one listener as a lullaby that forgets its own ending. The paper bore no fingerprints, no watermarks, only the faint impression of what might have been a thumb pressed too hard in the corner, as if the composer had paused mid-thought and never returned. All these ledgers, trinkets, half-melodies pointed not to madness, but to a terrible, methodical intention. There was no rage in Blackheath Hall, no violence in the vulgar sense. What unfolded there was quieter, more deliberate, a transaction conducted in silence, sealed not with blood, but with absence. And as the years passed, those who encountered the remnants of that transaction did not speak of ghosts or demons, but of a deeper violation, the sense that something living had been exchanged for something that merely persisted, and that the price had been paid not once, but in monthly installments, counted out in silence and sealed with a father's signature. As the decades advanced, Blackheath Hall passed through indifferent hands, at least, to a retired colonel who used it as a hunting lodge, then to a charitable trust that briefly contemplated converting it into a school for delicate youths, a plan abandoned after 3 pupils reported dreams of girls singing in the walls. The property stood empty for much of the 80s-90s, its gardens reclaiming the gravel paths, ivy creeping over the window frames like slow fingers testing a locked door. Yet even in neglect, the house resisted oblivion. Local farmers claimed their dogs would not cross the boundary hedge after dusk. Postboys left letters at the gate rather than approach the porch. The structure itself seemed to absorb silence, as though the very plaster and oak had learned to hold their breath. It was during this interlude of abandonment that patents once scattered and anecdotal began to coalesce into something resembling a case. The first systematic inquiry began not with an official body, but with a man whose name would later be struck from academic records for unscientific speculation. Dr. Edmund Vo, a lecturer in moral philosophy at Cambridge, who had developed an eccentric interest in what he termed domestic hauntings, phenomena rooted not in castles or catacombs, but in the intimate spaces of hearth and hall. In 1897, Voss published a slim, privately printed monograph titled On the Architecture of Absence, in which he cited Blackheath Hall as a primary example of what he called contractual haunting, a spectral residue, not of violent death, but of a deliberate surrender enacted within the bounds of domestic authority. His argument rested on a meticulous cross-referencing of parish registers, bank records, and oral accounts, revealing that the payments from Whitmore's ledger coincided precisely with anniversaries of his daughter's births, that those payments ceased entirely upon his death in as though the obligation had expired with the More provocatively, Voss noted that the girls' names disappeared from all civil documentation after 1874. No death certificates, no marriage licenses, no emigration records. Legally, they had simply ceased to exist. Voss's research deepened when he located an elderly woman in Cheltenham who had once served as a companion to Miss Mallory during her convalescence. Though frail and partially blind, she recalled her employer's final days with startling clarity. She spoke often of the coins, the woman said, not gold or silver, but tokens cold to the touch, with no face upon them. She said Alistair had shown her one, and that it bore a single word: Vigil. This detail, at first dismissed as the fantasy of a dying mind, gained weight when Voss unearthed a footnote in a rare 17th-century treatise on familial oaths, referencing a custom among certain esoteric Protestant sects of binding the firstborn through vigil pledge, a vow in which a parent facing ruin or despair would offer the presence of their child not to death, but to waiting, as a kind of living anchor against chaos. The child was not killed, nor banished, but rendered perpetually available to an unseen claimant, their voices, faces, and names held in abeyance as surety. The vow was said to be sealed, not in blood, but in silence, and maintained through periodic affirmations. Hence, the monthly payments, the lunar notations, the music that ended mid. Further corroboration emerged from an unexpected quarter: the diaries of Reverend Ambrose Kell, the village rector during Whitmore's final years. Though Kell had publicly maintained that the Whitmore household was a model of Christian fortitude, in adversity, his private journals told a different story. In an entry dated February 3, 1880, he wrote, "Visited A.W. this evening. Found him seated in the drawing room with 2 empty chairs opposite, tea set for 4. He spoke to them as though they answered. When I asked after the girls, he said, they are closer now than ever. I left troubled, not by madness, but by conviction. He believes them present. And where I fear, he is right." Another entry from the following November noted that during a service for All Souls, Whitmore had placed 2 white candles on the family pew. "Not for the dead," Kell wrote, "but for those who have not yet been released." The rector burned his diaries shortly before his own death in 1889, but a single copy survived, hidden in the lining of his traveling case, discovered only when the case was auctioned in 1904. The true turning point came when Voss gained access through a chain of discreet inquiries to the sealed portion of the Whitmore estate papers held in trust by a private bank in London. Among the documents was a single sheet of parchment, unsigned but notarized in 1872, bearing the imprint of a wax seal depicting an eye within a circle. The text, composed in archaic legal phrasing, described a conditional transfer of stewardship over 2 wards of affection to a party undisclosed, with the stipulation that the wards remain within the bounds of the dwelling and unseen by common eyes, in exchange for the preservation of the family from dissolution of name and estate. The document contained no names, no dates beyond the year, and no indication of the counterparty yet. It was witnessed by a magistrate whose signature Voss recognized from other obscure records, involving disputed inheritances and unexplained disappearances in the Midlands. Most chilling was the final clause: should the steward fail in duty, the wards shall be reclaimed, and the name erased. The word erased was underlined twice, in ink that had bled through the page. These discoveries did not solve the mystery, but they transformed it. No longer was Blackheath Hall the site of a private tragedy. It had become evidence of a transaction conducted within the interstices of law and belief, where a father's desperation had invoked a logic older than statute. The horror lay not in what was done, but in how rationally it had been arranged to. A man of ledger books and Sunday sermons could, with clear mind and steady hand, exchange his daughters not for gold, but for continuity, for legacy, for the illusion of control, in a world teetering on the edge of modern uncertainty. And as Voss pored over these documents in his dimly lit study, the silence around him grew heavier, as though the very air remembered the cost of such bargains. Dr. Edmund Voss, once a peripheral figure in academic circles, found himself increasingly consumed by the Whitmore case, to the quiet dismay of his colleagues and the growing concern of his family. What had begun as a scholarly curiosity soon hardened into an obsession that reshaped the rhythms of his days. He abandoned his lectures on Kantian ethics, citing pending research, and spent months corresponding with distant archivists, tracing the magistrate's signature from the 8 parchment to a string of similarly veiled transactions across southern England, all involving families of declining means, all featuring the phrase "wards of affection," all ending in silence. His study, once orderly and sunlit, became a labyrinth of pinned maps, cross-referenced chronologies, and yellowed newspaper clippings marked with red thread. Friends noted a change in his demeanor, e spogles, listened more, and often paused, mid-sentence, as though catching a sound only he could hear. In his private notes, he confessed to dreaming recurrently of a piano playing a single unresolved chord in an empty room, and of walking down a corridor where 2 pairs of small shoes worn at the heel, laces neatly tied, stood waiting outside a closed door. His most consequential discovery came not from paper, but from place. In 1901, Voss secured temporary tenancy of Blackheath Hall, under the pretense of writing a county history. The house, long shuttered, received him with the indifference of stone and dust. Yet from the moment he crossed its threshold, he recorded sensations that defied rational explanation. "The air in the West Wing," he wrote, "carried a residue of warmth, as though bodies had recently occupied the space. Mirrors in the upper halls reflected not only his own form, but, at the edge of vision, the fleeting impression of movement, not ghostly," he insisted, but as if someone had just stepped behind the glass. Most unsettling was the music room, though the piano had been removed decades earlier. Voss claimed that on 3 successive evenings, always just after 8 o'clock, when the last light bled from the sky, he heard the faint resonance of strings vibrating in sympathy with an unhurried melody. He tested the room with tuning forks, with silence, with companions who heard nothing. Yet Ty Maloney, he would stand in the center of the chamber and feel, rather than hear, the ghost of a harmony hanging in the air like breath on winter glass. It was during this stay that he uncovered the final piece of the puzzle, not in a drawer or behind a panel, but beneath the floor of the conservatory, where the postman had once glimpsed shadowed figures, using tools borrowed from a local gardener. Voss pried up a section of tile cracked by frost and found, embedded in the earths below, a shallow iron box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay a child's diary, its pages brittle but legible, inscribed in Clara Whitmore's hand. Unlike the formal accounts of visitors, this was a record of intimate terror, written not in fear of violence, but of erasure. "Papa says we must be very still." One entry read, "Still like pictures, still like dolls. If we speak too loud, or laugh when not permitted, the listener will know we are not ready." Another page described nights when the walls hummed with counting, and how she and Eleanor would press their palms together under the bed covers to remind themselves they were still 2, not 1. The final entry, dated April 1874, ended mid-sentence. "He brought the tokens again tonight, cold as river stones. Said the vigil has begun." Eleanor cried, but I did not, because the listener hears tears, and the rest was torn away, perhaps by Clara herself, perhaps by a hand that wished no final plea to remain. Voss copied the diary meticulously, then reburied the original, claiming later that to remove it would be to break the silence that binds them. His reasoning, once anchored in empirical inquiry, now bore the markings of ritual respect. He began to leave offerings in the house-white flowers on the piano stand, 2 cups of tea steaming on the conservatory table axe. He described not as superstition, but as acknowledgement. Colleagues who visited him during this period reported that he spoke of the Whitmore girls not in the past tense, but as though they were still waiting, still listening. "They are not dead," he told a skeptical friend over port in 1902. "They are held, and holding requires a witness." This notion that presence could be sustained through memory, That silence could be a form of custody became the core of his unpublished magnum opus, The Ethics of Witnessing, a manuscript that vanished after his sudden death in 1905. His end, like so much of his work, was shrouded in ambiguity. Officially, he succumbed to pneumonia following a chill contracted during fieldwork in damp conditions. Yet his housekeeper later recalled that on the night before his collapse, he had returned from Blackheath Hall, agitated and pale, muttering about coins returned and the third bell ringing out of season. His desk held a single new note. The vigil is not broken, it is transferred. No one knew what he meant unless one considered that, in the weeks following his death, villagers near Ashwick reported hearing piano music again, faint but clear, on windless nights, and that, in the hall's empty parlor. 2 fresh cups of tea were found cooling on the table, though no one had entered the house in years. The truth of Blackheath Hall, when it finally emerged, did so not as revelation but as whisper, a quiet certainty that settled over those who had followed its trail, not through documents or diaries, but through the weight of absence itself. There was no grand confession, no unearthed contract naming a demon or a deity. Instead, the horror lay in what had been willingly surrendered, not lives, but belonging. Alistair Whitmore facing the ruin of his lineage, his wife dead, his finances fraying, his name on the brink of dissolution, had not sold his daughters into servitude or sin, but into a kind of liminal stewardship, a vow so ancient it predated the church, yet thrived in its shadows. The listener, the vigil, the tokens marked only with a single word. These were not the trappings of occultism, but the remnants of a folk theology long buried beneath Victorian rationality, one that held silence as sacred and presence as currency. To give a child to the vigil was not to kill her, but to render her perpetually available, to bind her essence to the hearth, so that the family name might endure, so that the house might never stand empty. The girls were not taken away. They were woven into the walls, their voices tuned to the house's silence, their breath held in the spaces between floorboards. This understanding came not from proof, but from pattern. In the archives of 3 other counties, similar cases surfaced, always involving fathers of failing estates, always occurring in the decades when industrialism eroded the old gentry, always sealed with monthly payments and vanished names. None of the children were found dead. None were seen again. But in each house, long after the fathers passed, servants spoke of footsteps in unoccupied rooms, of teacups moved, of lullabies hummed just beyond hearing. Folklorists later classified these as threshold, but those who truly listened knew better. These were not spirits returning, but souls never released. The vigil was not a punishment, but a covenant, one that demanded not suffering, but stillness, and in return offered the illusion of continuity. The Whitmore girls had not been betrayed. They had been preserved, like pressed flowers in a family Bible, their vitality suspended so that the structure around them might stand a little longer against time's decay. What made this truth unbearable was its intimacy. This was not the horror of strangers or monsters, but of love twisted by desperation. Alistair Whitmore had not raged or wept. He had signed, paid, and waited. He had sat for years across from empty chairs, certain that his daughters were near, that their silence was loyalty, that their absence was sacrifice. And perhaps, in the logic of the vigil, they were. For in that strange economy, presence was not measured in breath or movement, but in fidelity to the pact. The girls, trained in obedience from infancy, had obeyed even unto vanishing. They had become what the house required, not ghosts, but guardians of its silence. Their voices, when heard, were not cries for rescue, but echoes of the vow fragments of a melody that could not end, because ending would mean release, and release would mean the family's final ERAs, ORE.Dovos. In his final months, had grasped this with terrible clarity. His offerings of tea and flowers were not acts of pity, but of recognition. He had become the new witness, the one who knew they were still there, still holding. And in doing so, he too had entered the covenant. The vigil demanded continuity. When one steward fell, another must rise, or the bond would unravel. His death, then, was not escape, but assumption. Those who later claimed to hear piano music after 1905 were not imagining things. They were hearing the Vigil's new harmony 3 voices now, not 2, the scholar's baritone joining the girl's soprano in a chord that refused resolution. The house did not hunger for lives. It hungered for memory, and memory, once given, could not be withdrawn. Thus, the horror of Blackheath Hall was never supernatural in the vulgar sense. It was profoundly human, a testament to how far a father would go to preserve what he believed was his duty, and how completely love, when alloyed with fear, could become a kind of imprisonment. The daughters were not stolen. They were kept, and in being kept, they became the house as a secret pulls its hidden breath. No exorcism could free them, for they were not possessed. They were pledged, and as long as someone remembered their names, as long as someone listened for their song, the vigil would hold.